The story opens on a bright night. Noble ladies and men all gather at a banquet dancing and chirping, but to the side stands a girl with pink hair carefully watching the nobles as if observing something. At the same time her gaze falls on a noble man who seems to be without a partner. His name, Cassio, and she immediately wonders what he's doing at such an event, almost as if he'd noticed her. He let out a frustrated sigh before turning away, and seeing this she immediately let out a breath of relief, thankful he's gone. She wasn't simply acting like this without reason, even though it only remains a faint memory now. Actually, a long time ago, she died in an accident and was reincarnated as the Villainess in a romance fantasy novel. In the original story, the male lead was famous for being cold and unapproachable, but after going through a phase of denying his feelings for the heroine, he eventually falls in love. However, the villainess Luciana, who had been secretly in love with him, tried every foolish way to torment the heroine, and every single one of her actions were eventually discovered by the male lead. As a result, she not only brought disgrace upon her parents and family, but also, after becoming the laughingstock of high society, she's completely ignored by the male lead and ends up fleeing disgracefully. Just the simple thought of it made her furious. An ending where she ruined her own family's reputation and then fled? There was no way she could accept such an ending. So she made up her mind. She was already living comfortably and luxuriously, and she knew very well both the male leads and female leads were meant to end up together. So there was no reason for her to follow the original plot. After all, she would only end up as a ruined villainess. Rather, she would play safer and try to avoid the male lead at all costs. So after confirming that he was gone, she stepped out of her hiding spot. However, perhaps because it happened to be her first time at a royal ball, she quickly got overwhelmed by the presence of so many people. In the heat of that moment, she glanced to the side and happened to find a cocktail drink. Considering she'd already come of age, she decided to try it out, without having figured out her alcohol tolerance in that body. On the other hand, the male lead, Duke Cassio, is quickly noticed by some noble ladies. They wear warm expressions on their faces as they ask what he's doing there. During the course of their conversation, he failed to notice a suspicious server beside them, who, taking advantage of the Duke's momentary distraction, slips something into his drink. He's also quick to walk away just in time as the Duke rejects the lady's offer to be his partner for the night. The Duke grabs the drink off the table and turns away without so much as a glance backward as he tells them he has other matters to attend to. But rather than the ladies feeling disappointed, their passion for the Duke only burned more. Finally, having some time alone, the Duke takes a gulp of the drink, relieved he can finally get away from them. But just then his eyes widened. He realized the taste of the drink is a bit different. However, before he is able to process it further, he is startled by the drunken shout of a lady. The villainess happened to be standing in front of him with an unusual bright expression, going on and on about how it all felt amazing. She dances happily, wondering aloud why she hadn't become an adult sooner. However, just then the effect of the alcohol kicks in and she stumbles to the ground. Before he is able to react, she lets out a loud shriek, crying that her legs wouldn't move and questioning what she should do. The next minute she lets out a gasp, almost as if she'd only just realized something. She wonders if she'd been a mermaid all along. Meanwhile, the Duke simply stands to the side, shocked by her antics. The next time she addresses him directly and asks if he would kindly return her to the sea, and now he finally understands that she isn't in her right mind. He extends his hand to her, thinking to just help her up and get out of there. He asks if she can stand, but she simply stares at him unclearly. The alcohol had caused her vision to be clouded, and for that reason she couldn't get a good look at the man who was helping her. But with the bit of reason left in her, she could only wonder who he was and why he looked so familiar. The next morning she lays in bed wondering why her whole body aches, and when her sanity finally returns, she's laying beside a man and he just happens to be naked. But more than the question of why she happened to be in bed with a strange man who was clearly unclothed, there was an even greater question after their eyes met. Why was she with Lift? A loud scream echoes through the estate, and the next minute she finds herself thrown to the floor. She stares at him in disbelief, asking how he could just throw her like that, but he doesn't seem concerned. Rather, he simply orders her to speak. He grips the sheet with a flushed cheek, asking her what she'd done to his body, or if she'd by chance fed him some kind of drug. He urges her to speak if she doesn't want to be interrogated, warning her to answer honestly because she will be held responsible depending on her answer. A dry scoff escapes her throat as she asks what he meant by asking if she'd fed him some kind of drug. She falls silent, the horror dawning even clearer on her as she wonders why she had to give up her first time like that. And even out of all men, it had to be Lift. She attempts to de-escalate the situation and explains that it isn't exactly anyone's fault since she was simply just as shocked as he was. She suggests they pretend nothing happened the previous night and go their separate ways. However, he immediately stops her, telling her it isn't possible. He repeats the same words, even clearer this time as he tells her, pretending it never happened. Last night is impossible. Actually, because of what happened the previous night, both the lady and himself are now marked. She stares at him in confusion and he again confirms it, directing her to mark on her wrist as proof. She glances down on her wrist and after noticing the mark wonders how she'd end up getting tangled up with Licht like that. She struggles to accept it and asks if a mere drunken mistake can really cause a mark to form. The tip of his ear redens as he opens his mouth to reply, confirming it actually can. After all, the only condition for marking was sexual intercourse. She falls silent, trying to understand everything. If what he said was really true, that they were marked, then it wasn't something ordinary that humans could do, so what exactly was Licht's true identity? Licht, whose gaze is locked on her, seems to notice something. He instead silently ponders on how it was exactly like he'd assumed. She started to get curious about who he truly was. He didn't waste any time and immediately admitted that he wasn't at all like ordinary people. The Cassio family had carried the blood of wolves for generations, descendants born from the union between a werewolf and a human woman. That was the origin of the Cassio bloodline. A shocked gasp escapes her throat. Nothing could have prepared her for that explanation. Wasn't even in the original story, but just when she'd thought that was all there was to it. He suddenly began explaining that the wolf blood passed down through generations forms a mark with one mate for life, and that person is loved until the day they die. He stares down at her, a brief moment of silence passing between them before he finally asks if she now understands the kind of situation they're in. She tries to speak, but he simply grabs her mouth, telling her it's enough. Then after, he delivers a harsh warning. If she dared to speak of whatever she heard there that day, then neither she nor her family would escape unharmed. She pushes him away as soon as he's done speaking, telling him she understands and swearing to never tell a soul, and after getting her answer, he informs her they'll speak later, at the New Year's ball that night. Later, she sits in her carriage frustrated. She wonders why he'd suddenly brought up werewolves, recalling how she'd read the novel and hadn't stumbled upon such a thing in the entire book. Almost immediately it occurs to her that the author had made a post shortly before she died, saying there would be a shocking epilogue. Her hand flies to her mouth as the thought strikes her. Could it be that is the unreleased story? So Licht was originally written as a non-human. At the same time, she happens to recall the romantic lines he'd said to the female lead in the story, swearing to love only her forever, promising that his soul belonged to her and that she was his one and only true love. She realized now that those were actually hints of his true origin. She lets out a loud shriek, realizing now those words will be directed to her. She lowered her head, thinking she didn't want to get in between the main couples, wondering what the point of twisting the whole story like that would be. In the end, she couldn't change her ending. Now she was the cruel villainess who went and seduced Licht because he and the female lead could even open their hearts to each other. She tries to figure out from what point the storyline had strayed off plot, recalling Licht was supposed to be with Deborah all day at the banquet. In the end, she still couldn't figure it out. She arrives at her family's estate a while later and is immediately approached by her older brother. She wonders what excuse to give, and in the end simply tells him she happened to spend the night out somewhere. To her surprise, her brother didn't press further. He simply remarked that she must be tired and asked if she wanted to head home. She was left with a blank expression, even though in that world they are so casual about men and women spending the night together. She couldn't simply get used to it. As they walk, her brother happens to notice the carriage she'd come back in. He quickly notices the details: a four-wheeled carriage made of the finest wood and gilded in gold, slightly below her usual standard but still quite high-end. He couldn't spot any family crest on it and quickly grew upset, wondering just who the bastard was that dared to lay a hand on his younger sister. At the same time, the Duke notices an item on the floorboard. After retrieving it, he stares at it intensely, wondering if the daughter of the Leslie family had left that behind. After all, she was the only one who'd entered his room. His eyes darted to the side. Nevertheless, he couldn't make sense of the day's event. Yes, he was drunk, but bringing a woman to his chamber seemed extreme. He clutched the item in his hand tighter, realizing there must be another person behind everything. But just as his anger rises, his butler, Godwin, asks to come in. He reports that the guest has been properly escorted to the mansion, however. He lowers his voice significantly. After all, he was crossing the line as he asks if he'd really formed a mark with Lady Leslie. The Duke confirms it without hesitation, and the butler's worry only heightens. His voice bears a sense of hesitation as he informs the Duke it is actually winter. He chooses his next words carefully, cautious not to overstep, as he finally ends with a question. You didn't tell Lady Leslie about that, did you? That every winter you go into heat. The Duke simply states to him with a barely concerned expression, and then later assures him it is fine since they'll be seeing each other again, and the ball. That night she stepped out onto the balcony, the gentle wind blowing through her hair as she wore a smile of satisfaction on her face. She could finally breathe. She recalls her father and brother's reaction to her, informing them that she will be attending another ball. It had been chaos ever since she started getting ready, and the only one who'd made it possible for her to come was her mother. Just then her thoughts are interrupted by the Duke. He simply stares at her, nearly expressionless, while reaching into his coat pocket. A while later he brings out a jewelry box containing a magical bracelet. He suggests she attempt to channel her mana into it, and after confirming she can, he explains that soon enough the mana stone will begin to glow, and when it does, it means he's summoned her. He glances to the side, his cheeks reddening as he adds the last detail: it also means his mating season has begun. At first, she doesn't seem to understand, but after pondering on it for a while, an image flashes in her mind and she instinctively lets out a gasp from pure terror. He doesn't seem bothered by her reaction, though. Rather, he moves on with his explanation, informing her that whenever she gets the signal, she used the magic device to come to his bedroom. He explains that it was just like she'd done before. All she had to do was channel her mana into it, and the teleportation option would activate automatically. She hadn't even gotten the chance to recover from her previous shock before he dropped another, his bedroom? She tried her best to find the right words, and finally she asks if he means she'll have to sleep with him. The Duke doesn't hesitate. He confirms it and adds that, just like the previous night, they have to spend the night together again. Curious, she asks if there isn't any way to break the bond from the mark, and he responds saying, not unless one of them dies. She asks if there have been researches, and he kills her hope one more time, telling her that all experiments had failed. Just as she's about to lose hope, she suddenly asks if she can continue the research. She explains that she'd graduated from the academy with a degree in magical manufacturing and asked to only see the research logs. He lets her down once more, telling her those contents are actually too secret family property. However, she doesn't back down. This time, she flashes her soft yellow eyes and pours her lips while muttering a gentle plea. He finally agrees and suggests they make use of a building in Lordwell to exchange information in secret. She suddenly falls silent, a question lingering in her mind: what if his rut comes before she's able to find a solution? So, she asks what'll happen if she doesn't show up during it, and he ponders for a while before responding, saying he might endure it for a day or two. but after that, he could lose control and storm into her bedroom. He turns his head to the side and explains that it isn't something he can simply control by willpower, and he might seriously offend her, so he would appreciate her cooperation. Heat surged through her heart racing faster, and in that moment she could only respond with a dry, "I understand." The next day, a man reports to the Duke with the house crest he'd found earlier and informs him he's tracked the culprits behind it. He explains that even after investigation through the top intelligence guilds, they'd found nothing substantial. The Duke looks up from his paper and asks if they'd really found nothing at all, and the man responds, saying yes. The Duke lets out an annoyed hiss. He recalled how he'd lost his memory and also formed a mark. He was sure someone had to be pulling the strings, but he couldn't figure out who it could have been amongst the nobles at the ball. But despite that, there was already one family off the list. He recalls Lucy's reaction when he'd handed her the crest, and without realizing it, a smile appears on his lips. By the time he finally realized, he wondered in a daze if he'd actually smiled while thinking of her. He tries to speak with Logan, but instead the person he finds in front of him happens to be Leslie's lady. However, after taking a closer look, he realizes it is indeed Logan. He tries to convince himself he'd only thought about her because of the yellow and pink vest, and immediately orders Logan to take off his vest. The Duke, finding his pink shirt underneath, orders him to take off everything else, prompting Logan to misunderstand the Duke's strange orders. Does the Duke have those kinds of thoughts about me? The Duke, catching up on the situation, angrily asks what he's thinking. Without wasting time, he orders his guards to get rid of everything yellow and pink in his room or anything significantly close to it. In the end, Logan is dragged out of the office while yelling for the Duke. The Duke, on the other hand, simply stands by the window, watching it all without the least bit of concern, and his mind still filled with images of the Leslie's lady. He marvels at the influence of the mark, his mind already filled with thoughts of the young lady, and he could only hope that she succeeds with her research. On the other hand, Leslie stood with a slight frown on her face as she pondered on how that was the day she was to obtain the research journal from Lift. She stared at her maid, wondering how she could ask her without seeming suspicious, and finally she decided to give it a try. First, she'll call her, ask her to deliver an errand, directing her to the address written on the note, and introduce herself as Lillian before handing them the handkerchief with her. After delivering that, she'd assumed it would be a success and she'd simply dash straight to the lab until Mary called her back and asked cluelessly if she was certain the address written on the note was really in Lordwell. She immediately moved to interrogation, pointing out that it was neither a residence nor shopping district. It was flat out suspicious, and also why she was making use of a fake name. She'd expected her to be suspicious, but she'd never guessed she'd ask such questions. But nevertheless, she decided confidence was the solution. She quickly put on a straight face and explained that she was preparing for a new research project, and added that it was a place that dealt in rare magical herbs that couldn't simply be found in the market. As she hoped, Mary happened to be convinced and assured her to leave it to her. Later, she appeared anxious while waiting for Mary. The next minute, she heard a familiar voice call her and immediately rushed to Mary, who'd returned with a box. She gently set the box on a nearby table before tattling to her lady that the place had felt a little strange. She explained that when she'd gotten there and opened the door, it was so dark inside, and she called out, "Just in case," only for her to feel a sharp blade pressed to her neck. She reported that she was there on behalf of Lady Lillian as she'd told her, and he checked the handkerchief and handed her the box before kicking her out like she was some intruder. She fell into her arms and cried about the mistreatment that Lucy ended up asking to take the rest of the day off. On the other hand, the question about who had dared to slip something into his drink at the ball lingered in the Duke's mind. The discarded badge also. Everything about it seemed suspicious, and since the Information Guild couldn't find anything, he decided he'll have to issue the order himself, as commander. The Karanta, it is evaluated as the second most powerful force after the Imperial Knights. He thought the elite knights gathered there should be able to handle the mission. However, The Caranta knights themselves were engaged in some gossip about the Duke, apparently. A lady with pink hair was seen leaving the mansion. A knight quickly identified her. She was from the house of Leslie and was Marquise Leslie's beloved younger sister. They danced around, celebrating that their commander's frozen heart would finally be melted. But another knight quickly grew suspicious, asking if the Duke wasn't rumored to have a thing already with the bold Count's daughter. Still, another knight countered that they weren't anything official, and the other knight responded that she was the first and only lady he'd ever spoken to. A particular knight happened to return at the same time. They quickly called out to him, asking why he'd gone to Lordwell, but he gave a cold response, asking why he should tell them that. He brushes past them, meaning to get away from their idle talk, when he is suddenly grabbed by one of them, who asks if by chance the person related to the mission is Lady Leslie. On the surface he appeared upright, asking if they simply can't stop praying, but in his head he simply recalled how he was told her name was Lillian. In the end he managed to pull himself out of his grip, clarifying one last time that it was classified and had nothing to do with House Leslie before turning away. But a particular knight continues, bragging that regardless of the hair color, soon the duchy will have a mistress. He hadn't at all noticed the Duke, who suddenly appeared behind him, asking if they all had a death wish. The satisfied look on their faces vanishes in a flash, replaced by pure terror as they are confronted by the Duke's interrogations. The Duke's words burn with fury as he asks if they'd all lost their minds, insisting they'll pay for daring to speak so carelessly. They don't wait for another word from the Duke before taking off without their shirts, yelling an apology in one voice. Barely a minute after, the vice commander of the Knights rushes to him, asking what is going on. All of a sudden, without wasting time, he informs her they'd found something of unknown origin in his chambers, and he needed about 3 people to quietly investigate outside. He warned that discretion was crucial, and she reports that she understands and will make sure to send a report back after careful decision. In a new scene, she stared at a report, muttering aloud that Licht's explanation about the make had been correct. However, while the mark between himself and the original female lead, Deborah, had been like the embodiment of love itself, the one between them was nothing more than a disastrous accident. She decides to stop overthinking everything. After all, she was studying to break off the mark, but the next time she picks up another report, she finds a shocking title. To safely pass the post-heat cycle, follow these instructions without fail. According to the report, it was merely a precaution, just in case one was faced with a situation where they couldn't avoid the heat. The magic tool was to be taken out, and I fused with the young lady's mana, and the spell written below recited. According to the report, once the mana stone began to glow, it would make the young lady's home as the return point. In a new scene, the Duke sits relaxed in a bath, pondering on how the intervals between thinking about the young lady were getting shorter and shorter. He pushes a part of his hair backwards, and his eyes happen to dart to the side. His cheeks flush red and his movements pause. Yet again he'd thought of the lady. He hissed in frustration, unable to imagine there were still things that could remind him of the young lady. He considers the frequency of her appearing in his mind uninvited, and finally confirms the butler's words. The heat period was truly around the corner. At the same time, Lucy summons her maid and sends her on another errand to Lordwell. However, before she leaves, she hands her a small jewelry box and explains that it is a small personal gift from her. Mary is overjoyed immediately. She takes her hand, barely able to contain her excitement and gratitude. However, Lucy just urges her to take it. She informs her she'll be leaving to see her brother off since he will be departing for a whole year. Later, the Duke receives a letter from Lucy. He opens it, filled with anticipation over what she would write it in. The minute he begins reading the content of the letter, a grin appears on his lips. However, before the feeling can settle deep, he quickly cautions himself to think he was grinning over such a simple greeting. In the letter, she'd asked him to prepare some ingredients and asked if he had more family records. He felt pleased with her report. However, there was a postscript he'd almost ignored. There, she made one simple request that the maid doing the errands isn't left too startled. He didn't waste any time and began writing a reply. He apologized, claiming it was his failure to supervise properly, and assured her he will relay her request for caution. He assured her she needed not worry about the materials, writing that he'd ordered them to be prepared in the finest quality. However, he added one more thing. In the letter, he explains that it seems some of the knights in the household have begun suspecting something between them. He suggests they must have seen her leaving the mansion. He tells her he'll warn them on his side and asks that she be cautious as well. A few days later, she dozes off going over the reports while her maid calls out to her from outside. Thanks to her persistent yells, she finally opens her eyes. She urges Mary to go and rest herself, promising to head in once she does so, and Mary agrees. Despite her attempts to stay awake, her eyelids grow increasingly heavier with keeping them open, becoming an impossible task, and she eventually gives in to sleep. The next time she opens her eyes, she finds herself in bed, and before she can process anything, the Duke pulls the curtains around the bed. She notices and tries getting up, however, her body fails to respond. She wonders if it could be that the heat period had already started. He didn't seem to be in the right mind either. Her legs wouldn't move, and while the distance between them kept decreasing, she could only helplessly wonder what was happening. She presses her teeth firmly, ready to give it one last attempt while his lips lightly scrape her cheek. The next minute, a loud shout tears through the room as she demands for him to get away from her, and shortly after, her eyes snap wide open and she finds herself still in her study. She breathes a sigh of relief after realizing it was only just a dream, but then she feels a throbbing sensation on her wrist. She rubs the mark gently, her gaze darting to the side where the artifact sits quietly. Almost immediately, she notices the gem glowing, and now everything finally makes sense. The heat period has already begun. She quickly grows nervous, a bead of sweat trickling down her face as she ponders quietly on what the night would turn out to be for her if she were to go to him now. She grabbed her hair furiously, her piercing scream tearing through the room. Her lips bend downward as the very thought of spending the night with a man who'd lost all his senses brought nothing but terror to her. Just as she was lost in thought, the throbbing sensation returned. This time, it stung even harder than before. On the other hand, the Duke jolts awake from his sleep covered in sweat. He clenches his teeth together as his very own body betrays him, consuming his reason with unimaginable heat. The pain alone was so excruciating it felt like he was being torn apart, but he really didn't know what to do as he truly didn't want to call her. The pain grew worse, and eventually he reached for the artifact in his possession and with the last bit of strength in him called for her. Moments later, the Duke appears to be in a total mess, with the only words he's able to mutter being her name. His eyes widened with a cruel realization. Why wasn't she there? And was she really going to ignore his signal? He was so flushed with heat he couldn't even keep his eyes open properly. His vision was a blur, and yet his mind was completely filled with thoughts of Luciana. A few minutes later, she finally arrived at the Duke's room. She's shocked when she finds him looking like he was in so much pain. She wonders if he had been suffering like that whole time and couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Just then, the Duke happens to notice her. However, just as she opens her mouth to speak, the Duke simply pulls her into his arms. A wave of relief washes over her. Originally, she'd assumed he would simply bounce on her mindlessly. However, he turned out to be rather gentle. To her, at that moment, he was almost like a puppy. However, it seemed the puppy didn't plan on staying innocent much longer. He brushed her hair away and sucked on her bare neck, and she, who hadn't at all expected that, could tremble in his arms while muttering for him to wait. Her body had entirely succumbed to his warm gaze and gentle touch, but just when she thought she'd seen it all, he grabs her hand and in a soft, pleading voice begs her not to push him away. He kisses her hand gently and finally calls her by her nickname, Lucy. Almost immediately she reacts to it, shifting her gaze to the side as she thinks of how it was a nickname. Only her family was allowed to call her, but he notices and pushes further, asking why she had that reaction, and if he isn't allowed to call her that. He offers a compromise and calls her by her full name, Luciana, gazing at her with longing, and she realizes she'd been wrong about him. He wasn't in a state to be reasoned with. Luckily, she still held the artifact in her hand so she could simply return to her room. However, almost as if he'd read her mind, he snatches it out of her the next minute. Holding it up, he tells her they no longer need something like, and without giving her time to back out, he kisses her. He pulls her into his arms, holding her tighter, while letting his other hand wander freely. She quickly realizes the atmosphere is shifting to not somewhat a simple kiss, and pushes him away. Once she breaks from his grip, he doesn't say anything. He simply mutters that her lips are all messy. In a swift motion, he sweeps her off the ground and flashes her a knowing smile before asking that they go to the bed. In less than a minute, she's dropped onto the mattress, and as the Duke unbuttons his shirt, he finally admits to her that he can't hold back anymore. On the other hand, she simply stares at him without saying a single word. The last time it had happened while she was drunk, but now she was completely sober and couldn't help but feel nervous about it. The same question echoed in her mind over and over: were they actually doing it? However, she suddenly feels the Duke's warm hand on her face. Leaning in towards her, he murmurs 2 words, "Relax, Lucy," before kissing her. He kisses her whole body and she instinctively lets out a scream. The tension in her hand fades, and before she catches on, she finds her fingers moving back and forth along his head. The Duke in response is shocked. He rubs his head back and forth against her gentle palm, almost like a cute puppy. The next morning, she wakes up cold and in pain, her body obviously bearing the aftermath of their interaction the previous night. It's by his handsome face that made it impossible to hate. She can't help but get angry. She thinks back to the previous night. Not for a single moment had he acted like a madman. Her face flushes and she grips the sheet tightly, trying to get herself to forget what had happened between them. She needed to return to her home, but she found herself unable to escape the Duke's firm embrace. Moments later, the Duke's eyes flutter open. However, the minute his gaze locks onto hers, his eyes go blank. The next minute, a loud noise echoes through the room. Once again, the Duke had thrown her down the bed without a single care, leaving her only able to stare back at him in anger as the déjà vu sets in. The Duke hurries to get dressed, telling her he'll bring the contraceptive potion, asking her to drink it before she leaves, and she quietly agrees. She felt stung by his sudden coldness, but when she took her time to go over it, she finally understood. The reason why last night happened was because neither of them were in their right minds. The kindness from the previous night wasn't at all Lick's true feelings. They were simply fake and brought on by his rut. The Duke finally seemed to notice her huffing angrily behind him, but instead of comforting, he simply asked in a dismissive tone if she shouldn't be taking her leave already. He reminds her of her words, how she'd asked him to be careful. No one else finds out, but she only grew more upset, understanding that he was merely giving her that look because she wasn't already on her way out. She waved it off, sucking all the humiliation in before stretching her hand forward, demanding for the magical tool. "You took it yesterday, didn't you, Your Grace?" The minute those words leave her mouth, the Duke immediately freezes as images of the previous night appear in his mind. He crouches down, wondering what on earth he'd done the previous day. Immediately after retrieving the artifact, he attempts to clear everything up and explains that everything she'd seen and heard the previous night were nothing but nonsense, and he'd like for her to forget them. To the Duke's surprise, she had no reaction to his request and only mentioned that she'd be taking her leave. But just then, he happened to notice something. He spotted an obvious bite mark on her neck from the previous night and immediately grabbed her hand to stop her from leaving. When she finally stands in front of him, he realizes he hadn't properly thought it true. He'd suddenly grabbed her because he felt bad. But now, he didn't even know how to bring it up. After a long time of silence, she pulls away, realizing he has nothing to say, and with the help of the artifact returns to her room before he can stop her again. Later, she happens to be taking a bath when she notices the marks on her body. After spotting the bite mark on her hand, she realized he'd even left bite marks and can't help but wonder what she'd expected. After all, he'd descended from werewolves. Moments later, her maid arrives in her room with her breakfast. She urges her to eat before it gets cold, and as she eats, she also assists her with drying her hair. During the process, she happened to touch her temple and realized she had a slight fever. Her maid had made such a fuss over her that she had to lay in bed obediently. After, she suddenly drifts into serious thought. Her parents had grown increasingly worried because she was always at the lab, and so it was only natural that she feared they might stop her from researching because they were worried about her. In the end, she blames it all on Lift. Thinking back to the previous night, Chaoise acted all sweet with her like a lover and then suddenly pushed her away again that morning. She poured in annoyance and then finally pieced it all together. Imprinting forces a mate to love, and the male lead spent the night with her, so he got imprinted. So naturally, the things he showed during his rut were just fakes caused by the imprint. It wasn't entirely hard to comprehend, rather she felt even more sorry for the Duke. After all, he was forced to become someone else, all of a sudden. And if she had to be honest, then she'd admit she hadn't entirely disliked it. In fact, she could feel a tiny, trivial tickle start in her heart. So before it all spiraled out of her control, she could only declare her resolution to break the imprint before the year end. 3 days later, the Duke gazes outside his window, his mind consumed by the thought of how he'd sent the lady away that morning. Just as he was wondering what to do, a voice suddenly offers a solution. "Why don't you apologize to her right away? Go find her and show her remorse." He turned around almost immediately, demanding to know who it was, and the voice responded saying it was his mater. Before he could get a grasp of the situation, more voices appeared, telling him the opposite of what the last told him. While one urged him to apologize, another warned him to not be fooled by the instinct pulling him towards her. But the final voice happened, left him a simple question. "If you end up drawing eternal hatred from your mate, what then?" Either the voices vanished or he managed to suppress them. Either way, he'd figured out the answer to the question. If she ever came to hate him, even the mere thought of it tortured him to the point of going mad. He wished to stop thinking about the young lady, so he decided to go somewhere she wouldn't come to mind. In a new scene, the Duke's carriage pulls to a stop and the coachman's voice calmly calls out from the front, informing the Duke they have arrived at the Leslie's estate. He'd originally meant to step away from his mansion to avoid thoughts of her, and yet, almost like a fool, he'd gone to her estate instead. Just as he was lost in thought, wondering what to do, he suddenly noticed a person with pink hair walking ahead. In that moment, he can only imagine Luciana staring at him in surprise. He rushes forward, intending to take her by surprise, but just as he's about to call out her name, the lady turns around and he realizes it is actually the Marquis. The entire atmosphere shifted and he could only rub his head nervously while offering a basic greeting. She asks why he's there, and she comes up with an excuse on the spot, explaining that his carriage had broken down around there and he'd been distracted while waiting after noticing how beautiful their garden looked. She offers to help, but he turns her down, saying the carriage should almost be fixed. He turns to his coachman and asks if it is almost fixed, and he responds sharply with a firm yes. Just like that, he ends up leaving the mansion without even getting to see Lucy. Later, the Duke happens to be standing alone when he hears some noble ladies mention they'd gotten an invitation from Lady Leslie. Apparently, she'd invited them to her birthday banquet. The other lady, filled with excitement, had asked when the banquet was to be held, and the other lady carefully whispered it to her. Annoyed by their cowardly whisper, the Duke punches the wall with his bare fist. That simple punch had unknowingly caused a commotion. The owner of the building arrived almost immediately, but just as he was about to confront the Duke, he realized he was a nobleman from his attire. The Duke's attendant that had only just returned from getting his carriage prepared informed him they'd take care of the repair cost and also asked that he keep the entire situation confidential. The Duke also apologized. To show his sincerity, he offered to pay double the estimated amount, and also offered compensation for all business losses incurred during that period. On their walk to the carriage, his attendant calls his attention to his strange attitude that day. He asks why he'd suddenly broken a perfectly fine wall. He suggests the Duke rest well once they return since there is no paperwork to handle that day, but after not getting a response he pauses and turns to find the Duke standing in front of a shop. He asks the Duke why he's that way all of a sudden, but he just remains silent. Then after following the Duke's gaze, he realizes he's staring at a pink diamond. He swiftly delved into deep thinking. The Duke had no interests in women, so surely it wouldn't be for a woman. Naturally, he assumed the Duke must have simply developed an interest in collecting jewels of late, and thought such a constructive hobby would be great for the Lord as well. He began explaining to the Duke that the quality was impeccable and added that the place happened to be run by a master craftsman. He happened to be receiving a lot of attention from noble ladies in high society, and they often described the feeling of wearing his accessories as the feel of being reborn. On the other hand, the Duke simply stared at it. He thought of how it resembled her hair, but even so, he couldn't be bothered and simply turned away. When asked if he wasn't going to buy it, he simply responded that such jewels were useless. However, that night, just as the craftsman was about to close, he was suddenly startled by the shadow of a human figure standing right outside his shop. He assumed it was a robber and dropped to his knees begging to be spared, but the Duke simply slipped off his cloak and asked if he could get it now, the pink diamond. Realizing it was the Duke of Cassio, a wave of relief instantly washed over him and he invited him in. He asks him to wait while he goes to bring it, however he returns to the Duke, empty-handed, and explains that it had already been purchased by another customer. A furious growl echoes through the room. The Duke pondered on how he'd ran there without a wink of sleep, only to end up getting nothing, and now he could only wish silently he had purchased it that afternoon. The craftsman, on the other hand, realized that since it was the Duke, he couldn't possibly let him leave empty-handed. He pleaded with the Duke to not be too disappointed, saying he happened to have something just as fine. Seeing the Duke turn to leave, he assured him he wouldn't regret it, and proceeded to give a brief story about its origin. It was a very rare item brought from the kingdom of Ivania, also known as the Heaven of Gems. The next day, Mary's voice echoes through the mansion cheerfully as she wishes Luciana a happy birthday. Carrying a small box, she explains that it is her gift to her and begs her to accept it, even though it's small. She informs her, the one more gift waiting for her, and she walks out, only to return with a white box and a sealed letter. As she reads the letter, Mary comments that her brother must have commissioned a music box just for her. After reading her brother's letter, she could only feel touched. Even though he was away, he had managed to prepare such a surprise for her. However, Mary didn't allow her to dwell on that too much. She quickly pulled her to the mirror, insisting that she was the main character of that day and she would make her shine brighter than anyone else. After assisting her with her hair, Mary headed out to run errands at Rodwell. She knocked at the door and waited patiently for a response. However, when the door finally swung open, she couldn't help but flinch. She wondered why she was getting scared again, and instead braced herself more confidently. She noticed he's more polite this time and wonders perhaps her lady's warnings had worked. She hands him the box and he accepts it and walks back inside, but she notices he hadn't checked the handkerchief and asks if he is no longer checking it. He didn't respond, rather he pressed his eyes shut in frustration. He recalls how the Duke had asked if he'd pointed his sword at her throat and warned him not to behave so rudely from then on. He thinks of how, because the Duke had emphasized security, they'd reinforced their defense without knowing it's led to such a hassle. Behind him, Mary stood boldly, asking if he wouldn't answer her anymore. Frustrated, he tried to yell in response, however she yelled back, asking if he'd really gotten angry so quickly. She switched to a gentle voice, acting like a frail young lady as she pointed out that she was so scared and asked what'll happen if she were to faint or something. To her surprise, he suddenly leans forward, reminding her he had already apologized for his rude behavior that day. Her birthday banquet ended successfully, and by the end of the day she finally recalled the box Mary had brought back from her errand. She placed the box carefully in front of her, but no matter how she thought about it, it seemed inefficient. Although thanks to the original method she'd managed to keep the research a secret. A downside to that method, however, remained the time it took to exchange materials for the research. It took 2 whole weeks, and the rude Duke showing up again and again was annoying, but thinking about the mating season only got her more upset. Finally, she decides to open the box, but to her surprise she finds a smaller box packed inside it. She holds the box in confusion, recalling how she'd requested magic candles, but there was no reason she could think of as to why it would be packed in such a fancy box. She decides to stop thinking further and simply brushes it off, assuming he'd gotten it from a merchant who valued presentation. But to her surprise, a pink diamond sat inside the box instead. She stares at the gemstone in confusion. It had nothing to do with the materials she'd requested, so why was it sent to her? Suddenly, her face goes blank. She wonders if the gemstone was actually a mana stone, and he'd sent it because he was still in heat. She didn't hesitate and tried fusing her mana with the stone. However, despite her attempts, the process failed. Finally, it hit her. It wasn't a mana stone, but an ordinary gemstone. She takes a closer look at the gem and realizes it isn't just any gem. Rather, it looked like the ruinette the ladies had been discussing earlier. They'd mentioned that it was really hard to find and described it as a pink gem streaked with gold, said to tremble the twilight of autumn. The ladies had gathered around her with a smile, pointing out that the gem happened to be the same color of her hair and remarked that it would suit her very much. Now seated in her room with the gem sitting carefully in front of her, she places a hand on her chin, letting her mind wander. If it was really how the ladies had said, a gem so rare, then it would have cost a great fortune, so why on earth would someone give that to her? Minutes later she smiles in satisfaction after confirming the condition of the herbs. She goes back to thinking about why the Duke could have sent her the gem, and finally it occurs to her that it might be her birthday present. She hurriedly waves it off, forcing a smile while commenting that the Duke doesn't even know when her birthday is. She presses the box shut, concluding it must have been put in by mistake, and decides she'll simply return it later. Returning to the original box, she thinks about working on the herbs, but then, thinking of their inefficient way of communication, she thinks of suggesting another method. Barely a minute later, an idea suddenly occurs to her, a more efficient method of communication. A week later, the knight strides into the Duke's mansion holding the same box in his hand when the Duke suddenly appears in his face, asking if he was just returning from Lordwell. He barely offers a response before the Duke collects the box from him and dismisses him before returning to his office. He decides to start with the letter in which she offers a proposal. First, she brings up how she'd been sending messages through a maid from Lordwell, but waiting for replies. She believed it consumed a lot of time. So she proposed a brave idea. Instead of exchanging letters, why don't they meet together directly in his bedchamber using the artifact? She explained further, stating that whenever he sends a signal, she can come to his chamber to receive it. After all, the artifact had a return spell placed on it. So just like during the heat period. Lastly, she'd asked him to send her a signal around 11 p.m. just like that night if he agreed. Even after reading the letter, the Duke appeared quite confused. He searched it thoroughly, wondering if that was really all she'd written. He'd read it again, more carefully this time, to ensure he didn't miss anything, while wondering why she hadn't mentioned anything about the gemstone. He recalls how he'd made sure to place it where she'd see it as soon as she opened the box, so surely she must have seen it. The next minute, the Duke's voice his anger aloud, calling it ridiculous and questioning why he should even care. He gets up from his seat, wondering if it could be that she wasn't moved by it. In the end, he decides it has nothing to do with him, insisting the reason he bought the gem was simply because that night he couldn't sleep, so he purchased it only to help him rest. Later, the Duke meets with Rick on the training grounds. Without any warning, the Duke suddenly drops the bomb on him. There will no longer be a need to go to Rodwell from then on. He looks visibly shocked by the sudden change of events, and in that moment he can only recall Mary's face as she told him bye from the last time they'd met. Still in shock, he replies with unrestrainedness, a sharp "why?" echoing between them. But the Duke merely folds his arms, his gaze narrowed onto him as he asks if he'd just asked him why. Almost immediately, Rick falters, his whole body trembles as he realizes his recklessness. He apologizes to the Duke, his head a turmoil as he asks himself what he was thinking, saying something like that. Nevertheless, he thought it was a shame he couldn't go any longer, but before he can settle with that thought, the Duke suddenly asks if he'd missed something in Lordwell. He responds the next minute with a firm denial, and the Duke simply says, okay. He tells him that was all he had to say to him and tells him he'd done well coming and going all that time. Then he dismisses him. Left alone, he lets out a sigh of relief, wondering why that maid had suddenly gone to mind, and thinks, honestly, she's such a troublesome woman, but nevertheless, it's not like they will be meeting anymore. A week later, she appears fully dressed in her room and looks like she's waiting for something. The day she'd asked the Duke to meet had finally awaited, and now all she was awaiting was the Duke's signal. However, when she finally received the signal, the charge she'd had moments ago completely disappeared. That day would make it the first time seeing him since the heat cycle and recalling how they hadn't exactly parted on good terms. It only made her more reluctant to suddenly visit him in his chambers. Still, she urges herself to push through it, accepting that it is simply the way he is. It wasn't like he was exactly the apologizing type anyway, so she just needed to hurry up with undoing the mark and break the chain between them. A moment barely passes before she hears the Duke's voice, sharp and direct, asking that they communicate like that from then on. He quickly averts his gaze while she stares at him cluelessly. He raises a hand to his mouth as he ponders on how she not only had the exact same clothes as the other night on, but she also walked around without a card. Still, he managed to maintain a businesslike tone as he asked what she'd brought. She responds, pointing out that she'd brought some documents relating to the research. She also hands him a schedule she'd organized and then explained right after that the experiment was ongoing, but the process was taking quite some time, so unfortunately, he'd have to wait a bit longer for results. She informs him they'll be moving on to the detailed stages of the work and shares her intention to ask him some more questions on his bloodline. She brings up how he'd mentioned that the roots of House Cassio traced back to werewolves and asked if that meant that he could also turn into a wolf. He asks if she means if he can transform literally and not figuratively. She nervously says yes and explains that she needed to evaluate just how much werewolf blood still ran in his veins for her to get accurate results. The Duke explains that from what he'd heard it used to be possible, but over time that ability to transform eventually faded, and as a result even he can no longer take on a beast form. However, even if the power is gone, the bloodline of the Cassio dukedom still retains traces of the werewolf's influence, as their physical abilities far exceed that of normal humans. Additionally, he reveals that even a single heir could carry on the bloodline because of that. Tracing this back to the original story, now she finally understands why the main character had appeared so strong. She realizes it wasn't entirely plot armor. After getting the answers to her questions, she recalls the last thing she has to do and brings out the gem, explaining that she'd found it in the box the previous day. The Duke immediately fell silent. In his mind, he simply thought she could have just kept it instead of bringing it back. But something suddenly occurs to him. Doesn't she realize the jewel is from him? On the other hand, Luciana sits cluelessly pondering on how she'd imagined the Duke would simply snatch the jewel back furiously the minute he saw it. Seeing his reaction to it, now it occurs to her, could he have sent it to her on purpose? Seeing her stare at him so anxiously, the Duke moves uncomfortably, wondering what to say to her. Then suddenly the Duke blurts out that it is a token of thanks. Having not expected that, she asks if she'd done anything to be thankful for, and he simply mentions how she'd been handling the research all on her own. Regardless, she thinks it's too much for a simple gesture of gratitude and wonders if he really gives that much without realizing its limit. To confirm he's fully aware of its cost, she tries asking if he knows what it's called, but before she can finish, he instinctively blurts it out. She politely turns down his gesture, saying she can't accept it, so he should send it back. However, he simply pushes it back, asking her to keep it. He asks her to consider it an apology for the other day. The morning after his heat cycle ended, he admits to the words he'd said he'd acted out of line, and also explains that when he pushed her, it wasn't intentional. The reason why he'd acted that way was actually something else. A slight pause follows, but when he decides to continue speaking, the more he tries to explain why he'd actually acted that way, the more the words catch in his throat. In Licht's memory, his mother was a beautiful person. At a banquet, the noble ladies spoke about how his father seemed to cherish his mother, and how they'd heard she didn't come out much. While he patiently stood by the window, he wished wholeheartedly to be loved by such a mother. But after finally finding his mother in the crowd, he rushed to her cheerfully, asking who the man that had just left was. But his mother was always so cold towards him, and he was always wanting to be loved by such a mother. One day, he'd picked some flowers with the help of the gardener, intending to give it to his mother after noticing she'd been in her bedroom recently, and unintentionally ended up walking into his mother and father arguing. She blamed him and called the pattern on her wrist disgusting and horrible, while his father tried to hold her back. However, when she saw it, her anger only worsened. She yelled furiously, calling both him and his father disgusting, while he could only watch silently with a tear-streaked face, wondering why she hated both him and his father so much. And then on a particular day, his father finally revealed to him their family secret: that in the Cassio family the blood of wolves flows. And only then did he realize that his mother thought of them with mixed blood as monsters. So he immediately wondered if he'd also live a lonely life from then on, even if he is not understood and ignored. Will he spend his life clinging to love? Time passed, and as he grew, his mother's health worsened, and he watched his father keep clinging to her, while she muttered the same thing with her fading strength about the blood being cursed and how she hated it, and it was disgusting and horrible. And he stared at his mother, wondering if even till her end she wouldn't look at him. Just then he heard her suddenly say she missed someone. Her lips curled into one final smile as she muttered his name with her last breath, Damon. He hurried to check her breath, calling her over and over while wondering who Damon was. At that time, her father happened to notice the engraving on her wrist was gone. His father, realizing what that meant, immediately broke down, asking how she could leave him. He seemed to know about Damon because he asked if it was still Damon till the very end, why it had to be him of all people, even at the last moment. 3 months passed and his father still longed for his mother. He hugged her picture, neglecting his duty as the duke of the household, and refused to be bothered. And as the son, he could only watch, wondering just how long his father would continue to cling to his mother. After that, time continued to flow. On a particular day, he strode down the hall, wondering if his father was in his mother's room again. He concluded he must be drunk again. Even after being ignored for decades, he couldn't forget his mother. He informed his father he would be going in, but as he stood in front of the door waiting for a response, he was crushed by this overwhelming sense of a bad feeling. He burst in without a response, thinking surely, but little did he know it was surely not. Finally, overwhelmed by longing for his wife, his father did the unthinkable and took his own life. He stood watching in horror, wondering why his father had made such a choice. So much so that he couldn't forget his mother, who passed away for the rest of his life even after the engraving was broken. So, did he love her? Even after sending his father off, the image of his parents mentioning Damon lingered. In the end, unable to overcome the uneasiness, he requested an investigation. The truth was just like he'd expected. His mother had a lover she shared her heart with before marriage. The Duke fell in love with Leticia at first sight, but Leticia's family firmly rejected his courtship. However, the Duke urged marriage in exchange for money. Her parents married her off to the Duke. Regarding Damon, as at the time he'd requested the investigation, his whereabouts had been unknown for 4 years. After learning that, he concluded that surely his father must have done something. But more than that, just like pieces of puzzles, the truth became clear that he too will face a painful end because of the engraving, just like his father. However, he refused to be madly in love and ruin someone's life or to crave the gaze of a partner. He refused to accept such a tragedy in his life. Luciana's persistent calls seem to finally pull him out of his own mind, and he opens his eyes to her, looking down at him carefully, asking if he is okay. She noticed his expression had dropped to a deathly pale and gently comforted him, assuring him it was all in the past and he didn't have to force himself to speak. To her surprise, the Duke suddenly got up and dropped to his knees. He grabbed the box containing the gem and once again told her he wished for her to have it. He explained that it was his own way of showing his gratitude and shared that he would like her to accept it. In the end, she gave in and took the gem. He didn't look like he'd back down, so she had no choice, but she couldn't help but think back on how the Duke had appeared to be a bit on edge from earlier. In a new scene, a person rushes muttering that they'd realized that he lost the badge. He appeared anxious, rambling that he'd hit a dead end and gritted his teeth, unable to believe that was happening. If he lingered there any longer, a man suddenly appears behind him, and before he can flee, he strikes him down, remarking that he'd done a good job of hiding all that time. The man continued, declaring that if he couldn't even complete his mission, then he should die, rather than scurrying around like a little rat. The man, still on the ground, immediately shot back, asking what he was saying, insisting he'd done as he was told. He tried to continue, stating how he'd messed with the Duke's glass, but the other man suddenly placed his foot on his mouth, demanding he shut his mouth. In a cold voice, he asked who told him to. He remarked that his mission was a failure, as in the end he let the Duke slip away. In a new scene, she happens to pay the Duke another visit. This time she reveals she has a bit of good news. She informs him they can finally move on to the final stage, and she'd finally decided on the final base combination to be used for the research. Staring at the list she'd handed to him, he points out that the ingredients on it happened to be a bit different from the ones she'd previously requested. She confirms it and explains that they're difficult to store, and it might be a hassle for him since there happened to be a lot on the list. However, the Duke simply brushes it off, assuring her his aide will handle it. She asks if it'll be possible to get a bit of his hair, about 5 strands. Without waiting for a response, she simply closes in on the distance between them, putting her entire focus on his hair. But before she could even pluck them out, she couldn't help but notice his expression. She hears the Duke's urging voice and immediately plucks the amount she'd held before getting distracted. Her exhaustion takes over and she ends up yawning in front of the Duke, and she informs him she'll be on her way. The Duke's gaze, who'd had his gaze fixed on her, notices she seems to be pushing herself a bit too hard with the research. He wonders what she'll do if she collapses from exhaustion and suggests, for the sake of her health, they proceed with the research a little more slowly. She seems baffled by his sudden concern. She turns to him, telling him she appreciates his concern, but shouldn't they break the imprint as quickly as possible? She forces a smile before adding that it is the only way they can go on to live their own separate lives. The Duke's face immediately goes blank. He steps forward, demanding to know what she means by that. Knowing she cannot exactly tell him anything about his fated partner, the female lead, she decides to indirectly tell him. She continues with a light laugh, saying something like that could happen. He might meet his fated partner one day, but she hadn't expected the cold Duke to look at her like she was spouting complete nonsense. He demanded to know what partner she was talking about, while she simply stared back at him cluelessly, wondering what was going on with the sudden overreaction. She explained further, saying, even if there was no dating partner, there was no reason for them to be together. After all, they were tied together by an accident. Before she takes her leave, she reminds him to give her a signal once the ingredients are ready. She informs him she'll be taking her leave then, but the Duke immediately calls out for her. He steps closer, gently urging her to stay still for a while as he places his hand gently on her head, pinching her nose with his finger to help stop the sudden bleeding. Seizing the opportunity, he brings up how even in that state she was still talking about pushing herself. He lowers his head, his mouth only several meters away from her ear as he whispers softly, asking her to endure it, even if it's uncomfortable, just until the bleeding stops. She remains silent, uttering not a single word in protest, with her mind stuck on how little of a distance happened to be left between them now. A few minutes later, he finally lets go, explaining that most of the bleeding appeared to have stopped. He turns away, asking her to wait there for a moment. The next time he returned with a cold handkerchief and asked her to tilt her head a little. While he cared for her, she couldn't help but wonder why he was doing such kind, gentle things out of the blue. She felt it was too unsettling, although she'd noticed a visible change in his attitude from when he'd apologized that much was completely unacceptable. She suddenly pulls away, declaring she'll do it herself, but he responds, telling her it is fine since it was already done anyway. She grabs the handle of the box, thinking of how everyone he showed such kind gestures. For a second she forgets that his kindness is nothing but a result of the imprint. Summoning her courage, she manages to ask if his actions now were also influenced by the imprint. He asks what she's talking about, but she simply assures him not to worry. As she brushes past him to leave, she tells him she still remembers what he'd told her, so she isn't misunderstanding anything. She tries to get the handkerchief cleaned and brought back, but he simply points out how it is clearly a man's handkerchief and asks if she was planning on washing it herself. She realizes she hadn't given it that much thought and then finally takes her leave. After she leaves, the Duke stands alone, clutching the handkerchief in his hand. He recalled her words to him that night and immediately wondered what on earth he'd been saying to her all that time. Just then he heard the same voice again. This time it called him pathetic. It asked if he wished to live the same life as his father too. And when it said no, it countered that, asking if he hadn't already fallen for her. To solidify his claim, he brought up how in the past he would have definitely gotten rid of anything tainted with that woman's trace. It urged him to look at himself now, saying no matter how much he blocked his eyes and ears and tried to deny it, in the end, he was still the heir of that family. In a new scene, the Duke walks along his garden path, wondering if time had passed so quickly. Seeing the flowers in full bloom, he couldn't help but think of her. He ponders on how the last time he'd seen her was the previous week and thinks he'll definitely be able to see her again the next day. Just then he happens to hear someone call his name, and when he turns around he finds out it is actually Deborah Marney from the Maidme family, and the original heroine. Seeing the Duke, she tells him that she'd been visiting the mansion regularly, only to keep getting told he wasn't around. The Duke responds with a cold reminder of how he'd asked her not to act overly familiar for no reason. She feigns ignorance, putting on a pitiful expression as she apologizes. She clutched her carousel tightly as she explained that she was just so happy to see him. She decided to switch to the main reason for her appearance and confidently asked if he would be her partner at the upcoming sewing exhibition. However, he responds in a dismissive tone, telling her that her question isn't even worth answering. Plastering on a wounded expression, she asks why and pushes further, asking if he already had a partner, but he just cuts her off harshly. She apologizes for keeping him for too long and turns to leave, but as she walks she can only wonder if she'd perhaps said something wrong, or if it could be that he has another woman. Later at night, the Duke sits staring at the Spring Festival's invitation. The Spring Festival is a grand imperial event held every spring, where they select the most beautiful woman who is then dubbed the Goddess of Spring. Aside from that, nobles use the occasion to find suitable marriage partners or to spend sweet romantic time with their betrothed. In short, the Spring Festival happens to be one of the most anticipated events for unmarried nobles who dream of love. More importantly, starting that year, the second princess was to be hosting it. Idris von Adelia, the second princess of the empire who never missed a chance to engage in cheap gossip. Looking at the letter, he assumes she must want him to attend since she has a strong love for anything that appears intriguing. He dropped the letter on his desk, emotionless as he thought, as if he'd ever attended before, except for the first year. However, this year will be no different. It had nothing to do with him. And even now, something else seemed to weigh on his mind as he glanced outside the window. It was about time the lady arrived. Moments later, right on cue, Luciana arrives holding a velvet box. He steps forward to receive the items she'd brought this time. However, when she walks past him, he simply freezes. He glances back almost immediately and blurts out that her soap scent happened to be different from usual. She stares back at him, confusion evident, but he simply moves forward, telling her it's nothing. Left standing, a sudden awkwardness hit her. She wondered what he'd meant about her scent, and if by chance he meant that she smelt bad. She goes as far as sniffing herself, recalling how she'd bathed not too long ago, but to her, nothing seems wrong. She actually smells so good. She happens to wrap up her discussion with the Duke that day earlier. However, just as she celebrates silently how she gets to return home early that day, she notices a familiar invitation sitting on the Duke's desk. Thinking back to a few days earlier, she'd received the same invitation and kept getting bugged by her maid, Mary, who asked if she wasn't going to ignore it just like last time. In the present, the Duke asks if she'd received the same invitation and if she was going to participate in the spring festival. She responds, revealing she'd decided to attend. Meanwhile, she simply pressed her eyes shut, pondering on how, even though she didn't want to, she simply couldn't defy the second princess's wishes. The Duke, on the other hand, appears agitated as a sudden realization comes to him. If it is the spring festival, she'll end up partnering with another man. Just the mere thought of her with another man was enough to drive him crazy. And since he couldn't stop her from going, he dropped a suggestion. What if she went with him? Her eyes widened almost instantaneously, a sudden exclamation escaping her lungs. But since he seemed to be serious, she could only have a silent crash out. A series of questions flood her mind like, is he out of his mind? If they were to suddenly appear at the spring festival as partners, people's reaction would undoubtedly be. She rubbed her head, wondering what was with the sudden partner proposal, thinking back to how in the original story it wasn't her but the heroine, but she quickly recalled the engraving. Originally, Licht would have accepted Deborah's request and filmed a sweet, innocent romance at a social gathering he otherwise had no interest in. However, because of the engraving, everything had suddenly become twisted. She'd expected him to take back his words without a second thought, but today he was suddenly being restrained and she couldn't help but wonder why. As for his sudden request for her to be his partner, it was something she had to refuse. He asks for why and she explains that they're practically strangers in the public's eye. If they were to suddenly show up together as partners, all the time they'd spent carefully avoiding suspicion would be meaningless. The Duke's expression tightens. He cusses in his mind, thinking of how he'd gone ahead and blurted it out like an idiot, but that's all. She spoke again, this time telling him even if it wasn't for that reason, she'd have to refuse anyway. When he asks why, she reveals it's because she's already promised to attend with someone else. The Duke immediately grew tense, with only one question lingering in his mind: who on earth could it be? She noticed his tense expression, and since she couldn't make any sense of it, she decided it would be best for her to simply leave. She thanked him for the offer and informed him she will be taking her leave. Without hesitation, she activates the teleportation spell and disappears despite him calling out for her. After her departure, the Duke can only ponder on the same question. He thought of how she would have to dance with him and spend a long time together. He imagined them making eye contact and was immediately filled with rage. However, he urged himself to remain calm. The lady was attending the spring festival, and to attend, a partner was at least required. In a new scene, Luciana's maid urges her to get up. She pulls back the curtains, declaring her season had finally arrived, insisting that she had to be the goddess of spring that season. She brings up how she'd always missed the last spring festival because she was always studying. Mary gently urges her to sit while she gets her ready. However, through it all she manages a simple smile as she thinks there's no need to overdo it, as the position of goddess of spring already had someone else in mind. Now that she thinks about it, she realizes Deborah will attend the spring festival and can't help but wonder who will be her partner, thinking back to how Lift had said he wouldn't attend. However, her maid's sudden voice pulls her out of her thoughts. She urges her to look at herself in the mirror and immediately showers her with praises, saying she's really beautiful. When she finally rushes outside, she finds her date already waiting for her. But her date, who happened to be her cousin, with a scoff reminded her she'd mentioned that she'd simply attend casually. And yet, she'd gone all out preparing. But instead of responding to his obvious provocation, she offers him an apology and asks if he'd waited for so long. He helps her into the carriage, and once the carriage begins moving, he immediately asks when she's going to be giving him the money she promised him. But she shoots back in frustration, telling him it'll be like she'd mentioned before. She'll send it before the end of the week. Unexpectedly, he suddenly asks her why she would even go as far as to pay for the festival if she really didn't want to attend. She paused and gave it a long thought. In truth, the real reason was that she simply couldn't ignore her social reputation, and the issue of finding a partner was also too burdensome. Her eyes dart to the side and she brings up how she'd been in seclusion since her birthday and says it's about time she showed her face. After a long time of simply sitting in the carriage, they finally arrive at the spring festival. Faced by so many people present, she simply stands awkwardly with her cousin. However, her cousin didn't let that moment pass and instantly demanded for some extra pay, saying he suddenly realized that it isn't worth it. Annoyed by his ridiculous attitude, she turns to scold him when she suddenly hears the crowd whisper about the Duke. Barely a minute later, she notices Lecht. Her eyes linger on him, her mind unable to get over his handsomeness, and the more she stared, the more she began to understand just why he's described as a top-class beauty in the original work. She decides to check who he'd come with and finds the vice-captain of the Karen Knights. She wonders why he wasn't partnered up with Deborah. After all, he'd only attended because she asked him. She delves into deeper thought, wondering if there was something else, when her cousin suddenly nudges her. She thinks he's joking around again and is about to scold him when she suddenly notices something. Staring at the familiar figure in front of her, she can't help but wonder why it is standing so close, especially right in front of her eyes like that. She grew increasingly anxious the more his gaze lingered, wondering if he realized just how many eyes were watching them. Regardless, she sought to quell all kinds of rumors before they even began. She greeted him politely, introducing herself as the daughter of the Marquise Leslie, and her cousin followed, introducing himself as Louis Dalton, the second son of House Dalton. The Duke also followed, introducing himself with a stern expression. Contrary to her expectation, the Duke remained with them, staring hard at her cousin in silence. She grew overly anxious in her mind, wondering if he was trying to mess with her, or if by chance that was simply a form of pressure for her to produce results quickly. But Duke opens his mouth to speak again. This time he inquired about House Dalton. He asks if it isn't the region renowned for its textile industry. Her cousin responds nervously, adding that it is especially famous for high-quality silk. Her cousin also began suspecting something was wrong. Faced by the Duke's intense gaze, he could only wonder why the Duke appeared so favorable. And yet, like he could lose it and throw a punch at any time. In an attempt to release the tension, Luciana steps in, thanking the Duke for his kind words. She reveals that the Earl of House Dalton was also her father's family. The Duke's mouth immediately dropped in shock. Without hesitation, she introduced Louis as her cousin, but the Duke only appeared more lost. He supported his jaw slightly with his fingers as a wave of embarrassment crashed down on him, as the realization settled within him that the worries he had were unnecessary, as her partner was only her cousin. After the resolved misunderstanding, his lips curl thinly into a visible smile, however, that only heightened Luciana's worries. She looked around and realized the stares were only growing increasingly worse, and just as she wondered how to get out of that situation, a voice suddenly called out for the Duke. The next minute, Deborah ran to him with a warm smile inquiring about his health, but before long, she trips. A hand reaches out to grab her before she hits the ground. Her cheeks grow crimson, her whole body stilling as her heart rises and drops faster, but that whole thought is shattered the minute she realizes it isn't the Duke in front of her. She silently ponders on the lady's identity, wondering if perhaps she was the Duke's lover. The lady doesn't waste time and offers an introduction, revealing that she is Ivan Ronai, vice captain of the Karanta Knights, and at the Duke's request she was serving as his partner for that day. Immediately, Deborah's face beams with excitement, eye lighting up as she realizes she isn't a threat, and quickly she smooths things over, ushering her praises, admitting she'd wondered at her disciplined, standing posture. On the other hand, Luciana, noticing the mood among the three seems to be getting friendly, takes the chance to slip away. Moments later, the second princess arrives and gives the opening speech. A few minutes after the princess's opening speech, the ball commences. The dance floor quickly filled as couples took to the floor, moving gracefully to the music. Noticing the opportunity, Deborah tried to strike up a conversation with the Duke, only to be met with his usual stoic expression. Her gaze drops to the floor the next minute as she realizes she'd been speaking to herself just like before. But she still couldn't wrap her head around why the Duke appeared to be in such a bad mood. What she didn't know was that the truth was right in front of her eyes. Luciana dances with her cousin, enjoying the ball when he suddenly feels the Duke's piercing gaze on him, so much so it felt like he could burn a hole through him. He didn't hesitate and immediately reported to Luciana, who then tried to confirm after, but when he met her gaze, his cheeks immediately flushed red and he turned his head in embarrassment. After the ball, a few of the noble ladies present gather around a table to share a few words, including Luciana. A lady suddenly joins them with her cat, explaining that the princess had said a cat would be allowed to attend. Luciana smiled to herself, wondering how long it had been since she'd last seen a cat. It was adorable, and she found herself quietly admiring it. The moment it noticed her, however, it hissed and arched its back in clear warning. Choosing not to provoke it, she decided to get herself a cup of tea instead. She raised a hand to catch a server's attention, but before anyone could respond, the cat suddenly lunged at her. In the end, she was left with a torn glove and several scratches both on her face and hand. Lady Haley immediately stepped forward to apologize. She explained that the cat was usually so gentle. Luciana rubbed her cheek gently. Although the wound stung a bit, she thought it wasn't something to get teary about, so she decided not to make a big deal about it. The lady, feeling remorse, offered to get her a new set of gloves, but she politely declined, telling her she had spares. She excuses herself to go get the gloves, but as she walks, her gaze is entirely fixed on the wound on her hand that only stings harder. She fails to look up in time and unintentionally bumps into a man's chest, but as soon as she looks up to apologize, she locks eyes with the Duke. He notices the scratch on her cheek and panics, demanding to know how she'd gotten hurt. His actions leave her momentarily stunned, and when she finally regains her composure, she asks what he's doing, pointing out that someone might see them. She tries to pull his hand off, but then he spots the wound on her hand also. He demands to know who had done that to her, and after carefully observing it, he remarks that it looks like it was done by a beast, warning that if she wasn't careful, it could leave a scar. She doesn't give him an exact response, rather she pulls her hand away and nervously points out that they were already too close. The Duke pauses for a while before turning away. He acknowledges his actions as a mistake, but walking away entirely, he reminds her to apply some medicine. Later, she searches carefully from behind a bush for Licht, and only after confirming he isn't around that area does she step out. If he was to keep acting unpredictably like that, she'd simply have to keep avoiding him. She thought to simply walk around comfortably in his absence when a hand suddenly reaches for her. Turning around, she finds a man greeting her with a pleasant smile. He takes her hand as he mentions that she hadn't shown her face since the ball, so he simply thought she'd forgotten about him. He places a kiss on her hand like it's nothing before continuing, saying now that he'd heard her call his name, it appeared his worries had been for nothing. He suddenly asks if she'd like the gift he'd sent, explaining that he'd had the jewel crafted into earrings for her. Intending to shut him down, she responds arrogantly, claiming it really doesn't suit her. However, despite her many attempts to blow him off, including rejecting his request for a dance, he simply doesn't take the hint. Without warning, he grabs her waist, insisting this is a perfect time for them to have the conversation they never finished. She realizes he has no intention of respecting her desires and backing off, so she turns to get help, only to find everyone barely paying them any attention. Just like the last ball, he was doing the same thing, getting all touchy, and just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she hears a sudden thud and notices him fall to the ground the next minute. She looks up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the gentleman who'd done such a wonderful thing when she notices the Duke in front of her. At the same time, the people around seem to finally catch up on what is going on around them. The royal palace knights also show up after hearing the commotion. The Duke offers a lazy explanation, saying he'd bothered someone who clearly already said no. A knight turns to her, hoping to get a lesser vague explanation on what had transpired between them, but the Duke snaps, immediately demanding to know if the lady really has to explain everything. On the other hand, after finally grasping the situation, the crowd immediately began questioning the relationship between the two of them. Before their curiosity could spiral into a barrage of questions, the second princess strode into the hall, her voice cutting through the commotion as she demanded to know what was causing all the uproar. The princess immediately orders for a report, and the knight immediately explains that the man had acted rudely towards Lady Leslie, so the Duke had simply stepped in to help her. She turns to Luciana and asks if everything she'd heard is true, and she confirms it, revealing he'd tried to force her to be his dance partner. The princess did not press the matter any further. Instead, she merely muttered under her breath, "How interesting." The Duke, a man renowned for his complete indifference toward young ladies, had actually stepped in to save her. Just then, Deborah appeared. The moment Luciana noticed her, panic gripped her heart. Deborah would surely find this situation suspicious, and if she began to suspect there was some sort of relationship between her and the Duke. The second princess caught the sudden stiffness in Luciana's posture and immediately wondered why she was so tense, and if by chance she had any relationship with the Duke. Regardless of the gossip, she had to maintain her dignity as princess and immediately switched to formality. After resolving the situation, she invites everyone to head to the center. Finally, the main event begins. The princess announces the candidates to be chosen as the goddess of spring for that year. She'd expected Deborah's name to be mentioned. After all, she was the original female lead, but what she didn't expect was that she would also be chosen as a candidate. In the end, she is forced to stand in front of the crowd and, even worse, just beside Deborah. After a brief moment, the goddess of spring for that year is finally announced, and the person whose name is mentioned is none other than Deborah MANHWA. With that, the spring festival finally closed. Luciana walked with her brother, relieved that day had finally come to an end. It had been more difficult than expected because of someone that she didn't wish to remember again. However, just as she settled with that thought, the curious voices of some ladies drift to her. They whispered about how the Duke had come to Luciana's aid, speculating that there must be something between them, daring to suggest they might be lovers. Others expressed sympathy for Lady MANHWA. "Why did it have to be Lady Leslie of all people?" one noblewoman muttered. Then a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Why not Lady Leslie?" The whispers died instantly. Everyone turned toward the speaker to find the Duke standing with his arms folded, his expression as distant as ever. Yet the words that left his lips said another thing. With an overbearing tone, he questioned aloud who suited the goddess of spring more than Lady Leslie and declared that year's spring festival invalid before the crowd. The next thing that followed after his brazen declaration was a shocked gasp, chorused at the same time by the people gathered. Their idle chattery fills the air as they question if the Duke hadn't had something for Lady MANHWA. But at this point, Deborah could barely hold back her tears. She'd had a simple thought. Maybe if she'd become the goddess of spring, the Duke would look at her. But now he seemed to even dislike it. Having finally reached her breaking point, she flees the gathering, but her actions only throw Luciana into a more complicated spot. The people present quickly sympathize with her, leaving all the blame to Luciana. They whispered about how everyone in high society knew that Lady Manny had feelings for the Duke and questioned if Luciana didn't know that herself. The crowd didn't seem to care and continued with even more daring remarks, while she simply stood bearing the weight of their heavy criticism. Finally, her cousin gently jerked her by her shoulder, snapping her from her thoughts. He suggested they move somewhere else first, checking if she could still walk, and she quietly declined, making only one simple request. "I want to go home quickly." That night, she'd played the role of a tired socialite who was finally going to retire to bed after a long social event to quell her maid's suspicions. But as soon as she took her leave, she jumped right out of bed and grabbed the artifact. Coincidentally, that day she also had to receive the materials from the Duke. She thought back to his actions that afternoon that had thrown her in a difficult spot and could only comfort herself saying that arrangement was better anyway. At least now she was going to find out whatever he was thinking that had made him act that way. That evening she greeted the Duke but stood with a stern expression. He seemed to immediately understand and turned his head with a guilty expression. He pointed to the already prepared box containing the materials she'd asked for and told her she could take them. However, she simply asked him to forget that, claiming they had more important stuff to discuss. She leaned forward, making sure he couldn't avoid her gaze before spelling out how she was in a difficult position now, thanks to what he'd done. She insists that isn't good for either of them, and he apologizes, saying he hadn't meant to cause her any trouble. He acknowledged that it was entirely his fault and she simply blamed the imprint. But still, she couldn't understand why he had to go so far. She brings up Lord Dimitri and asks why he had to get involved. He tries to come up with an excuse, but his words fail him at that exact moment while Luciana simply continues with her words. She admits she appreciates the help but mentions they were surrounded by so many people and points out that an act like that was bound to start up rumors. However, the Duke didn't flinch. He simply retorted that he'd had a personal grudge with that specific noble. She remained surprisingly calm, telling him he didn't have to settle his personal grudge at the Spring Festival, but the Duke unexpectedly cracked. He shot back, claiming she was obviously in trouble and she could only let out a shocking, "What?" He continued like it wasn't anything, insisting that the bastard had clung to her like a leech and he couldn't just do nothing. He explained that the minute he'd seen him be so disrespectful towards her, his body simply moved on its own. Faced by such devotion, her lips parted on their own and she blurted out, simple yet sincere question. "Why do you care if Lord Dimitri was rude towards me?" This time the Duke swore it wasn't on purpose. His body had simply reacted, and even the declaration of the festival invalid. The words just slipped out. He reveals that he had been in the crowd when he heard all the nonsense they were shouting about her. He admits he was furious and didn't need to hear anymore because he'd honestly thought she was the most beautiful woman there. She appeared to be stuck on his words when he suddenly stepped forward, cupping her face like it's nothing, asking her if she was okay and if she'd gotten hurt but Dimitri. For a moment she seemed to forget her place, got swept away by his gentleness. She'd actually dared to think he truly cared for her. However, when her gaze fell on the imprint under his sleeves, her senses returned. She immediately turned away, asking why he was worried about her. He tried to speak, but she cut him off, asking if he realized he was acting like her lover at that moment. Without saying anything, she turned and retired for the night, with one thing lingering in her mind. She must break the imprint as soon as possible. The next day, her family has brunch with another family. The nobleman complained about his son who happened to have no interest at all in marriage. He also brought up the young Marquis Leslie, who was also of the same conviction. Her parents brushed it off with a light chuckle, bringing up how children of that day never listened to their parents. However, the man suddenly mentioned they must be relieved since at least their daughter didn't seem to carry the same opinion. Her parents' mouths immediately dropped. The man, seeing their expression, asks if they haven't heard about the rumor going around that she and the Duke Cassio were lovers. The man mentioned how it had been the talk of the town since the spring festival and that rumors had a tendency to be exaggerated, but many nobles claimed to have seen their daughter together with the Duke. Later that night, during their family dinner, her father brought it up again while they were awaiting her. Just then, her mother recalled how she'd run into the Duke at the estate. She explained to her father that his carriage had broken down for a moment, but she admits she did find it odd that she'd heard him call out Lou first. Finally, after waiting for a while, Luciana joins her parents in the dining hall. Her mother observes her for a while. She didn't appear like someone who was dating and thought it had to be a false rumor. Nevertheless, a mother's worries are endless over a child, so she thought to ask just to be safe. She brought up the rumor going around that she and the Duke were lovers. However, her reaction only confirmed it was just like they'd thought. Her father, drawing from her reaction that she hadn't heard it at all, assured her it wasn't a big deal. Her mother chimed in as well, explaining that they'd only heard people had seen her with the Duke and simply wanted to confirm whether it was true. Both of her parents smiled reassuringly, asking if it was nothing more than a baseless rumor. But faced with their quiet trust, she couldn't bring herself to lie. So, she admitted it. It is true. I was with Duke Cassio. That is all for now. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more recaps. And don't forget to leave a comment down below if you'd like a follow-up part.